Welcome back to the channel. In this video, Aron Ra takes a hard look at the historical Jesus and how much of the familiar Christian story can actually be tied to a real person. He argues that generations of storytelling may have blended different people and legends into the Jesus Christians recognize today. It's a fascinating argument that gets more interesting the deeper they go. Let's get into it.
Anyway, Aaron.
Christianity is largely about shirking responsibility. And Christians, of course, will not recognize this because they think that we don't believe, the unbelievers don't believe because we want to shirk responsibility. We're taking responsibility. We can't say the devil made us do it, right? We don't break the law because we know it's the law. We know people invented the law, not God, right? And so we're going to do what we can to support and enforce the law. Whereas Christians very often will try to say, well, it doesn't matter that I sexually molested my sister because Jesus has forgiven me, and so I shouldn't be criminalized. Because, that argument was made by the Duggar family trying to get out of prosecution. And lots of different Christians, once they got under charges, they try to use that argument. I'm soaked in the blood, and so I don't have to go up on charges. And that's, see, that way you don't actually have to do anything to help people. You can just pray for them that they'll accidentally get the help that they need without you doing anything about it, because that's another shirking of responsibility. And that it doesn't matter how badly we mess up this planet, because Jesus is going to come back any minute now to destroy everything anyway. So it doesn't matter if we try to preserve our resources because we don't need to, because we are in the last days, and we've been in the last days for 2,000 years. Right? Well, we just keep making shit worse. But the big problem here is in the mythicism, historicism, is arguments like Bart Ehrman. You try to put them in a category where you have Ehrman's argument, and Ehrman's argument is that Jesus existed, but he wasn't the Christ. Okay, so that's a step away from the typical Christian argument that Jesus existed and he's God. Right, or he's the son of God, or the more Muslim and Jewish argument that he's a prophet of God, or that he's just a shyster pretending that he knows God. He's Joe Biden saying, "I know Obama." But and then on the other side, on the other extreme side, we have Richard Carrier, who says there's absolutely no truth of the Jesus myth at all. It's entirely mythological, and there was no guy. Well, Price and Fitzgerald, I think, are a little closer to my camp. And I know that Price is, because much of my inspiration actually comes from him. He said some things that are going to seem a little crazy too. But one of the things that Price has argued is that when you read Josephus, and Josephus is talking about how he found 3 people being crucified, and that he recognized one of them, or he recognized his friends, and that he went to the magistrate. I forget the name. Anyway, I can't remember the name. I always have these moments, but a name that I could recall at any other time I don't have now. But anyway, he went to go get the Roman magistrate to have these friends cut down, and they are cut down, and then one of them died, or 2 of them died, and one lived. I think it's the way it was. And then this is all being viewed from the opposite perspective when you read Luke, and suddenly you see Joseph of Arimathea, which is dangerously close to Joseph Bar Matthias. Joseph of Arimathea, Joseph Bar Matthias. Now, if you look at how much the Muslims have corrupted the name of Noah and the name of Ecclesiastes, or the name of Satan, how they've changed that just in that little bit of time. Imagine, it's not hard to see how these names were corrupted, between Joseph Bar Matthias and Joseph of Arimathea.
Right.
So it looks like when you read Luke that we're talking about the same event. These people are both writing stories looking at each other while they're doing it. This is according to Bob Price. And I thought, okay, that's an out there kind of a theory, but it kind of makes sense. When you think about this, and because other people are going to say, well, we have all of this other documentation of Jesus. Do you? Really? One of the problems is that when Joseph mentions the James, the brother of Jesus, the anointed, he's not talking about that Jesus. He's talking about Jesus of Damnius,
son of yeah,
who lived at a different time and is a completely different character. We know who that character was. We've got historical documentation for that guy. We don't have it for your Jesus, but we got it for this Jesus. We know that that's a different Jesus. Josephus wrote about 19 Gzi. 19 different Jesuses. So, and Jesus of Damnius ain't your guy. Now, Christians will adamantly argue that he is, and until you prove absolutely that he is not, because that's what they need, absolute proof that their belief is wrong. They don't need the slightest proof that it's true.
Right.
But they need absolute proof that it's wrong, because they're going to be completely unreasonable.
Of course. I mean, yeah.
The problem is that there's a. I like to look at things in a bell curve. I try not to think in binary terms where you're good or evil or whatever. That most people on most subjects, we're kind of around here toward the middle. And then it just becomes an issue of, are we slightly left of or right of center, is what it comes down to most of the time. So, and I try not to deal with too many absolutes.
Right.
There are few. There are a few things we know that are absolutely certain, like there was never a global flood. We know that for absolutely certain. But there's not a whole lot.
The best you can do is go back to Ice Age. That's like the best you can do. And even then, I don't know if water covered every mountain. I mean, come on, no. We
can actually go back a lot further than that to previous ice ages, Precambrian ice ages. At least 2 identified so far, where the entire planet is covered in a thin sheet of frost at least.
Right.
So anyway, and they wanted to call it an ice age where everything was frozen, but the fact is that it would have to have been thin, because there's not that much water on the planet. So like a thin frost, and then some actual liquid water in some pockets here and there. So getting back to the subject, there was a historic element to Jesus. It wasn't like Richard Carrier says, where it's just purely mythology. And when Bart Ehrman is talking about, well, we have record that there was, we have all these indications. Most of what he's talking about is simply Christian historians that grew up Christian. We're never going to question that, right? They're just never going to come about questioning. Well, they always argue for consensus. Well, all these historians accept that Jesus was true. Well, yeah, they do, when they were raised never to question that. And it's the ones that question them to say, you know what, I'm not sure if Jesus did exist. Whoop, now you're a mythicist, and now you're outside, and now we're going to shun you. But what the argument really is when we're talking about Jesus, I've heard arguments from Christians where they're actually talking about Jesus ben Ananias. And I'm like, that reference that you're talking about, that's not Jesus of Nazareth. That's not your Jesus. That's this other Jesus again. So then we have one of Ehrman's books, where Ehrman himself brings up the 16 different gospels that never made it into the book. And so we have a hero character that everybody's talking about. And where did this hero come from? Right? Well, there might have been a real guy at the base of some of this. But then when you get to where we have certain books that are kicked out because he killed a child in one of these books, in one of these gospels that didn't make it.
Wasn't he a child too or something? He was a child who performed magic on something because the kid was mad at, or some crap. I can't remember.
Yeah, and I like another one that was rejected, which is the Gospel of Thomas, in which Jesus said the only wise thing that Jesus has ever said in any of his gospels, period, and it's one that didn't get in the book. In the Gospel of Thomas, they ask him, "What do you think about circumcision?" And Jesus says, if God wanted the people to be circumcised, we would have been born without foreskins.
Yep, that's right.
There you go. That's the only wise thing Jesus ever uttered, and that didn't make it into the book either. So there's another problem. So I argued with Fitzgerald, as I started to say earlier, that there are some things that Jesus did that are just so stupid that we would have to believe that this is a person that did this. There was a first century faith healer out there conning people, who doesn't know when the fig season is, who doesn't know that farmers in his time at that time, in his location at that time, knew that there were other seeds, like the black orchid, that are smaller than the mustard seed. Jesus isn't a farmer, right? He claims to be a carpenter, maybe because he got wood. I don't know. But then this is why he's hanging out with male apostles. But he... And which is something that Paul had issues with, because he obviously hated women and was seemingly closet queer himself.
For that guy.
Yeah, I mean, and why is it that the most adamantly anti-homosexual people are the ones that
or
One.
against you, yeah, against you being with a woman.
The ones that we catch having sex with a male prostitute in the car, or snorting coke off their ass of a male prostitute, or going into a hotel room with a rent-a-boy whose advertising criteria was that he had an 8-inch uncircumcised penis.
What?
Yeah.
That's a weird, and that's a weird.
And he was Brazilian.
Oh my gosh. Well, I tell you this real quick on the fig tree thing. I know that if we literalize that, of course, the fig tree, I know for a fact the small seed thing, that's obvious. But for the fig tree, I'm not so certain it's supposed to be taken literal in the aspect of whether it is meant to be Israel. And really, even if it isn't literal, it's still bad, because what it's saying is it's anti-Semitic in many ways, because it's saying the fig tree, this Israel's about to end. It's like, really, this anti-Semitic notion I get from the text is that, God's taking away what he had with the sons of Abraham, and he's going to have new people seated at the table. It's like, oh, snap, what's going on here? But
exactly what David Fitzgerald said.
Right.
That's what he was explaining to me when I said that this shows a fallibility of humanity. But he says, but it doesn't really, because all of these things are parallels, and each of these words refers to or implies or means. They're supposed to which is why I hate arguing scripture, because I can read what it says and I can criticize what it says, but when they always say, well, when it says this, it really means that,
right?
Except on every other Thursday, or except when the moon is full, or when I want to argue with somebody else about a different thing. Then it becomes literal again. But until then, it's metaphorical, or it's metaphorical when I can't defend it, and literal when I just want to make believe.
Right.
Yeah. So,
well, I heard this argument with Dr. Bob, and I'm sure you would attest to this because you brought up some fascinating things earlier and now. Dr. Bob was debating William Lane Craig on this, and William Lane Craig attacked the dying and rising God theme, right? Which we all, you, me, and Dr. Bob totally agree that it's there. I mean, it may not be exactly the way you want it. This God might not have been a man in any way, shape, or form over here that's Osiris or something else. And Jesus might be caricatured as a man. Oh, let's not talk like that. That's totally different things. I hear historicists argue that all the time. Anywho, on that note, I wish that Dr. Bob nailed this idea on the cross here during their debate, because he said, well, the problem with the dying and rising God thing is all the other dying and rising gods are agricultural. However, the New Testament's not. It's historical, this, that. Are you kidding me? Look at the parables. Listen to the agricultural use of the wheat and the chaff, and come on, man. You're telling me this has no agricultural implication, and that this is not another possible rewrite of Dionysus, the vine, the grape? This is agriculture. Maybe I'm looking into it differently. They just can't see what we're looking at, or the Christians are avoiding these things like the plague.
So what I suspect is the case is I think that there was a faith healer who had a strong following and was also got in trouble over this. And then we have lumped onto him these legends about how he's supposed to return. And like the one beautiful thing where Jesus says that he hopes he doesn't return in winter, because that'll be cold, but he doesn't understand that the earth is a sphere. And in the other hemisphere, it's not winter. When it's winter up here, it's not winter down there. So it doesn't matter if it's winter. It's always winter somewhere, or it's always the opposite season somewhere else. And Jesus says that he testifies verily that of those few of you who are standing with me now, that not all of you will have tasted death. Some will, but not all will have even tasted death before you see me returning in the clouds at the right hand of power, which is pretty explicit. We're going to see Jesus return while some of these guys are still alive. And then they want to come up with every kind of interpretation for how it's death in the body, but not in the spirit. Well, how can it only be some of them then?
Yeah, no, I like
that. Doesn't work. So we have a faith healer. And there was at a time when Jesus was a common name, and people are commonly lumping different GZI together. And then, as you noted, well, we've got so many dangerous parallels with Joseph, and then also with John the Baptist, right? And then with Moses too. Right? We have so many different, and they're obviously just borrowing interesting elements. It's like when we watched, remember the movie Independence Day? I remember reading this brilliant article. This is the things that Independence Day was based on, or the tropes that they borrowed from previous movies.
I never saw it.
So the only new thing about Independence Day was that the spaceships were 15 miles across.
Wow.
The spaceships were bigger than any spaceship had ever been seen in a not even Star Wars would have a spaceship inside the orbit that would be that big, right? That was it. So they show all of these things, and when they show this in Independence Day, this is when we first saw this in 1952's The Day They Come, whatever. And when the head of no, this was a different movie. They did the same thing when they did Cloverfield. They said they took the scene with the Statue of Liberty's head, and they said, okay, we've also seen this in this movie, and in this movie, and in this. And I think Independence Day was one of the movies that was previous, and then there was another one previous to that. So I mean, there's tropes that people borrow. That it's just the way that people tell stories. That's why we can't find anything absolutely novel. And and this was my thought. I was hanging out with some pagans back in the day, and this one guy declared himself that Dionysus was his patron deity. And I said, well, my problem is that Dionysus was said to turn water into wine, but not like Jesus did. Jesus did it like Penn and Teller did it, where they pour water into a jug and then they turn the jugs upside down and pour water out. Right? Well, anybody can do that. Penn and Teller did that. But what Dionysus did was he made the springs of the earth spring forth wine. Now, I'm not saying that anybody was ever actually there or actually saw wine coming out of springs. Obviously, this is just a story. None of that really happened, right? It doesn't have to be. There does not have to be a kernel of truth to that. Just something somebody made up. But people want to put things. When they have a hero, we start lumping shit onto it. And my position is that we've done that so many times in more recent history with Vlad Tepes, with Robin the Hood, and with Arthur, King of the Britons. In each case, there's a historical element that has nothing to do with the legends that are built around it. And we don't even know anymore what that kernel of truth is. But we know, like in Robin Hood's case, Maid Marian, made up. She does not even appear in the story until centuries later. Suddenly she appears, and then she's in every version after that. There's a Maid Marian. Robin of Locksley, that was the name of it. There may have been a Robin of Locksley. We know that there was a John Little that had like 17 kids. That's the kernel of truth that we've got to that story. Right, that's it.
That's a lot to hinge on, right?
Exactly.
This taking this back to Jesus in what you're saying here. I know I'm going to sound a little crazy probably to some people who are your fans, but that's okay. I speculate. And one thing I learned is just to evolve my ideas as I learn. I don't think it's too far-fetched, and neither does Dr. Bob, to suspect some kernel of legend on Caesar being applied to the coming of Jesus as Titus, as some would suspect. I'm not saying everything that Joseph Atwell espouses is obviously in the vein of accuracy, okay? And I'm not saying
he's not, even among mythicists,
right.
Atwell does not have a good reputation. And of course, mythicists have a shitty reputation against everybody that wants to just take the status quo,
right,
and not put any challenge to that. So I'm very hesitant,
right,
to adopt anything that Atwell has suggested. And I don't automatically subscribe to whatever Carrier
right.
has suggested. Even though I understand what he's saying, I just don't know how to verify it to the conclusion that he has. What seems to me, and after talking to a number of others, and especially Price, about how some of this was put together, is that people are confusing and conflating different people named Jesus. So I think if you could find any of the historic sources for Jesus, maybe there were only 2 or 3 of them, but any of them, and even if there was only one guy at the basis, if there was one first century faith healer, and he's in the first century, because there's evidence that he might have been. There's indications in history that he might have been earlier. That the legends that are based on Jesus are actually based on an earlier character.
Years, maybe.
Yeah, well, another 100 years, another century earlier. Yes, and some of that comes from the early church fathers, because
I know that
they
the Jews in the Talmud.
And the early church fathers seem to be talking about a Jew. They don't realize. Do they realize? Did Justin Martyr realize that he could have met someone who had met Jesus? Because he's not talking about a Jesus who lived a generation or 2 earlier. I mean, actually a little bit more than that, but it is still possible that that Justin Martyr could have met somebody who had met Jesus. I think, if I remember the dates right, I think he's still within the range of a human lifetime from that. But what he's writing about is a character that predates Hercules, who predates. How you have Apollo carting the sun across the sky in one myth, and then you have Helios, the same character essentially carting the sun across the sky in another one. Well, Jesus is also depicted as carting the sun across the sky. Jesus is this sun god. Jesus is described in Psalm 19 according to Justin Martyr. So he doesn't seem to be thinking that Jesus was a guy who died just a few years earlier, or just say 2 or 3 decades earlier. He's not thinking of Jesus that way. And obviously not 2 or 3 decades. Substantially longer, but just barely within the range of a human lifetime. He's talking about somebody from the basis of the Old Testament, at least the way I read it. And other people have interpreted that maybe what he's saying is that Satan went back in time to create these pagan gods to make them counterfeits of Jesus.
Right.
But nobody ever suggested time travel. At that time in history, not one author ever suggested time travel was possible. That's a new science fiction topic. Justin Martyr definitely was not progressive enough to imagine time travel. He thought Jesus was eternal. Jesus existed from the beginning. Jesus is the Son, essentially. Jesus existed in Psalm 9. Jesus predates all of these pagan gods. Jesus didn't live in the fourth decade of the first millennium. Jesus was several millennia ago, is the way that I interpret it. I've heard somebody had a criticism of my interpretation of that, and I remember that there was a criticism. I can't remember what it was or how valid it might have been. So I'm sure somebody will remind me.
Yeah, someone watching this, because I love my fans. I mean, I love going through the comments and listening to people's ideas, and there's some that are just over the top, and I'm like, okay, this guy just took a hit of something. I don't know what he put in his bong, but
so here's my thought in a summary. Even if we were to imagine that it's not multiple Jesuses being combined and conflated, which I think is almost certain, and there's not going to be any historic record for probably any of these guys, if that's the case. But even if there was only one guy, it's not going to be that guy. That if we had a time machine, I'm certain about this, if we had a time machine and could go back, and it was somebody that spoke Aramaic and just hunt down, you're not going to find Jesus. You go back to 32 CE, you're not going to find Jesus. You'll find 50 other GZI. You'll find Graham Chapman from Life of Brian. You're going to find a whole bunch of apostles, because you Jews produce messiahs by the sackful, is what they used to say, right? Or what they said in Jesus Christ Superstar, and I've read it in other places too. And I think because the Bible actually does make that comment, that the Jews would keep producing all these messiahs, so they're getting them all combined and conflated. But even if there was only one guy, even if there's just one Jesus who somehow was born in both Galilee and Nazareth, or is from both places, and also went to Egypt without going more than 50 miles from where he was born. If you take out all of the contradictions, there's one guy somehow did all of this.
Right.
Put him in your TARDIS, bring him into the 1970s, and let him see Jesus Christ Superstar. If you don't tell him in advance, he would not know that story was about him. How can there be a historic Jesus if that Jesus character doesn't recognize his own story? Would Vlad Tepes recognize Bram Stoker's Dracula as being about him?
No.
Take him to any Dracula movie. Vlad Tepes is not going to know who the hell that character is. This has nothing to do with him. Same thing with King Arthur. Same thing with Robin Hood. None of these characters would recognize their own stories. Robin Hood, what I think would be the most outraged, because we remember and glorify all these things that we've attributed to Robin Hood, that we know were all of these details were added centuries later. Everything we know about Robin Hood was made up centuries later. We know nothing about Robin Hood from his actual life, apart from that he might have known Little John.
This is the end of the video, And what I like about Aron Ra's position here is that he doesn't need some grand theory where every single detail about Jesus turns out to be fake. Maybe there was a preacher behind some of these stories. Maybe several people were mixed together. Maybe later writers took an ordinary guy and piled legends on top of them. Aron can be wrong about one connection, right about another, and none of that creates a problem for atheism. Christians are in a completely different situation. They need a very particular version of this ancient story to be real. And that's where I think Christian apologetics gets away with something way too easily. They'll spend 20 minutes arguing that Jesus existed and then act like they've moved 20 steps toward proving Christianity. They haven't. They've barely left the parking lot. A Jewish preacher existing in the 1st century is about as remarkable as finding out there was a rabbi in Jerusalem. The Christian claim isn't that some guy preached, attracted followers, and got executed. The claim is that this guy was literally God, performed miracles, came back from the dead, and now determines what happens to you after you die. Those claims need their own evidence. You don't get the resurrection for free because you found the preacher. And I think Aron's comparison with legendary figures gets at something Christians really don't like dealing with. A real person can exist underneath a mountain of fiction. We already know humans do this. Stories get better in the retelling. Heroes get better speeches. Enemies get more evil. Coincidences turn into prophecy. Ordinary events get supernatural explanations. A few generations later, people inherit the finished story and treat every piece of it like it arrived as a package. Nobody has to be sitting in a room saying, "Today we're going to invent Christianity." That's such a weak response Christians sometimes give to skepticism, as though the only alternatives are either the Gospels basically happened or somebody deliberately fabricated the entire religion. There's a massive amount of room between those two possibilities. And look at how Christians themselves treat everybody else's religious stories. Tell a Christian that Muhammad received revelation from Gabriel, and suddenly they know exactly how skepticism works. Tell them Joseph Smith received golden plates from an angel, and suddenly testimony isn't enough. Tell them about miracles attributed to another religion, and suddenly they want evidence. They can recognize legendary development perfectly well when somebody else's religion is on the table. Then Jesus enters the conversation, and the standards change. Now ancient testimony becomes incredibly persuasive. Now people dying for beliefs supposedly tell us those beliefs were true. Now stories written decades later are treated with enormous confidence. Now an empty tomb story is supposed to get us within touching distance of a resurrection. Come on. And there's another advantage Aron has here that I think gets overlooked. He can actually change his mind. If somebody digs up amazing evidence tomorrow showing there was definitely one specific historical Jesus behind these traditions, great, accept it. Nothing about atheism requires Jesus to be fictional. Aron could throw out half of his current reconstruction and still ask the exact question Christians eventually have to answer. Where is the evidence for the supernatural part? That freedom is important. A Christian apologist can revise little details around the edges, but there are conclusions they simply cannot surrender without damaging Christianity itself. Jesus can't just be another failed apocalyptic preacher whose followers kept the movement alive after his death. The resurrection has to remain. His divine status has to remain. At some point, the scholarship runs into theology, and theology already knows which answer it needs. That should make anyone suspicious when apologetics gets presented as though somebody simply examined the historical evidence and happened to discover Christianity sitting there at the end. There's also something funny about demanding that skeptics prove Jesus didn't exist. That's backwards. Nobody owes Christianity proof that its central character was fictional. Christians are making the larger claim. If all we can reasonably establish is that some preacher existed and was later surrounded by stories, then that's all they get. You don't fill everything we can't verify with Christianity and demand atheists remove it piece by piece. And even if Aron's historical model ends up being too aggressive, the Christian still has the harder road. Strip away every questionable parallel he mentions. Give them a historical Jesus. Give them the crucifixion. Give them followers who sincerely believed something happened afterward. You still haven't demonstrated a resurrection. You definitely haven't demonstrated God. That's the part I wish more of these debates stayed focused on. Christians sometimes celebrate winning the smallest historical argument while assuming the biggest supernatural one came along with it. It didn't. If you disagree, tell me exactly where you think the historical evidence crosses that line in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel. Also, go support the original creators and check out the full conversation.